Hello everyone. For this month's book review, we covered Coin-Operated Americans by Kocurek. This is a really fun book. It's a little bit different from what I normally read. Normally I've been reading a lot more about the console market and other social issues that go into basically video games and the video game industry. This one looks mostly at the arcades and everything. This is something that I didn't normally really do. I didn't play a lot of arcade games growing up. I was sort of born and sort of got into video games much later, like around 89, 90. By that point, arcades were kind of in the decline, but you could still find them every once in a while. Mostly you could find, there's usually one at a mall, but there wasn't like a dedicated building for an arcade, and that's something that Carly kind of talks about. Once you got into the 90s, I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit in the book here, but once you got into the 90s, you saw arcades being moved into like more of a restaurant type thing. So you would have like Chuck E. Cheese, that was one of them. So you would go in there would be basically areas for like a birthday party, then there would also be video games as well. And they would be there with a lot of the like mechanical games, like pinball, skee-ball, that sort of thing. And you can find now, and again, I'm going to be jumping around a lot in this, just to apologize for that in advance. She talks about sort of the adult arcades that have come up as well, sort of later on, the Dave & Buster's, that sort of thing. But in the most part, she talks about how video games sort of became like a real cultural phenomenon in the early 80s. She does touch a little bit on sort of the video game culture before that, but for the most part she's focusing on arcade games. And it sort of paints a very interesting picture, because she touches on how video games were always sort of seen as like the new media, and how new media sort of gets blamed for a lot of the evils in society. Kind of like how, well, this is actually true, pinball games were associated more with gambling, that sort of thing. And you have arcade games that kind of got associated with like juvenile delinquency and that kind of scene, because it was obviously a lot of kids that hung out in arcades, and you didn't always have them in the greatest areas, and there are some cases where the FBI had to go in and like break up the arcades because it's a cash-only business. Organized crime could get in there pretty quick, sort of like they did with pinball machines, that sort of thing, and so a lot of the other stuff as well. But she does move into some other things about how there were actually like lawsuits against cities that tried to ban arcade games. And one of them actually went to the Supreme Court, and I was really amazed to hear about that, because I really hadn't heard about this one at all. I have it written down here. Eventually, I wish I had my stuff a little bit better. Well, before we get to that, she talks a lot about one arcade company called Exidy, and sort of how they moved along the sort of the violent video games with their game Death Race. Honestly, I think she was kind of blowing that one out of proportion. That I never really heard anybody talk about the arcade game Death Race, but I know it existed. I have the NES port, and I think it's kind of stupid, but I could see how back in the 70s and whatnot, they would see this game and be like, oh my god, what the hell is going on? Even though movies had been moving in that direction anyway, and we're probably still way ahead of video games and anything even close to like video game related violence. She also talks about Twin Galaxies, and Twin Galaxies is still around today. They sort of lost a lot of their cultural significance. I mean, they've actually had quite a few scandals recently. If you look up a lot of the cheating scandals that have gone on, you'll see a lot of the cheating scandals within like the arcade business, where people didn't actually have the high scores that they claimed they had, and they had no evidence to prove that they had those high scores. She doesn't touch on that here, because I don't think that that happened when she was writing her book. She might have gotten that done beforehand. But it is a very interesting story, where you have a lot of people she does go into this part a little bit, where you had a lot of people sort of trying to turn video games into their profession even back then, sort of seeing their high score as like a status symbol, kind of like the old high school athlete who, you know, had that one game in high school where they scored 4 touchdowns. They constantly talk about that, whether you want them to or not. Arcade people could kind of be the same way, where it's like, I had a high score on Asteroids back in the 1980s, and I had that high score for a very long time. I mean, it's a high score in a video game, guys. It's not that big of a deal, at least to most people, especially now that high scores don't really matter that much. Yes, the Supreme Court case. This is one that I really want to go into more, and maybe I'll sort of do a separate thing on this, but she talks about how the town of Mesquite actually tried to pass a city ordinance against Aladdin's Castle, which is an arcade in Mesquite, Texas, that would require children 17 and below to have a parent present while they're playing video games, which is hilarious if you think about it, because kids would just get dropped off at the arcade by their parents. Like, they would go there after school, they would have like a birthday party there, or if they're in the mall, they would just go to the arcade, hang out there until their parents are done shopping. I mean, it was relatively convenient. You give the kid like $2 and quarters, tell him to have fun in the arcade. Once that's done, he's kind of SOL as far as he wanted to go keep playing or anything like that. But yeah, it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they ruled that that sort of thing wasn't. I can't really remember how they ruled, so I won't get into that. But it was just really funny to read that. Like, video games went to the Supreme Court, not necessarily on whether or not you should be able to play them or they should be violent or that sort of thing, but whether or not cities could regulate them for like age categories all the way back in the 80s. That was really kind of interesting to read about. I had never heard about that before. Yeah, you have a lot of these. I mean, you can see it now today, where a lot of people got influenced by the arcades, and this is another thing she goes into. The arcades influenced a lot of people. You can see it in quite a few of the more popular YouTubers. They played a lot of arcade games growing up, and that sort of basically they got the video game bugs, sort of that sort of thing, where they just fell in love with video games and they just wanted to keep playing them. Not exactly the same way things happened to me, but definitely playing video games inspired me to do a lot of other things. I unfortunately had to play a lot of the console ports for arcade games, which I thought were great at the time, until I've actually been able to go back and play the arcade ports, and I was sort of like, oh well, I wasn't playing the best possible games at the time. Now she goes on and says she makes a few weird comments about culture which don't really fit into it, and I don't really want to get into it, but it is part of the book, and I will sort of touch on this here, and I do agree with her for the most part. She talks about women in the arcades and how depictions of arcades always show like male-dominated, which was true, but they tend to not show that women were playing arcade games as well, because of course they were. Why would they not? You have female gamers today. You have female gamers back in the early 2000s. You have them in the 90s. You have them in the 80s. Of course, you would have them in the arcades. Because again, parents would just drop their kids off of the arcades, and I hate to break this to a lot of people, but girls were children as well. I mean, they would obviously go to these arcades. So it just seemed a little bit weird that she was breaking this down, but she was building up to sort of the current issues today, where I guess you had like the Gamergate issues, which I did not really follow, did not really pay much attention to, but where there's sort of been a backlash against women in video games, or at least there was a few years ago. I think it was really stupid. I mean, of course women play games. Of course they do. Why would they not? video games have been around for 40 plus years. Of course women play them. Are they the majority? No, they're not. Are there certain games that are tailored to them? Yeah, there have been for a very long time. I mean, you even look back at the arcades. Women made arcade games. I mean, they famously, Centipede was programmed by a woman. There were a lot of women that worked at Atari. Was it the best working environment all the time? Probably not, but they still worked there. And this is just one thing. I really don't want to go into it, but yeah, it just seemed very odd that this one chapter was in the book, because it didn't feel like it really fit to me, and it felt like it was something that Carly wanted to get off her chest. It was significant, but I didn't think she needed to go into Gamergate as much as she did. Overall, though, it was fine. It still fit into sort of the narrative she was talking about, sort of showing how the past was still being reflected today. And I understand that. It made some sense. It just, to me, it was something that didn't really need to be in here. She does talk about the historical preservation of video games. This is where I'll end on the historical preservation, because this is the one I really, really care about a lot. She talks about how arcade games are getting, basically the ROMs are getting dumped online, and you can play them using a MAME emulator, which is great, and that's something that I really love. But one thing that's really cool is they're also getting released in bundles. So you can play the arcade ports on the home consoles, because now a lot of the home consoles have basically passed where the arcades were. There was a time when we really wanted like the arcade port, or at least close to an arcade port on our consoles. And now we are actually at the point where we can definitely do that. So you'll see companies like Capcom, they released their beat-em-up bundle, which is awesome. And has a few beat-em-up games that I don't think were ever released here in the United States. Or if they were, they had like a very limited release. And a lot of those are really awesome to play, especially since you have unlimited continues at this point, which is definitely wonderful. That was one thing that a lot of the console ports suffered from. They would give you just like 3 continues, and then that was it. If you lost, then you had to start the game over. Now it's just like, just keep playing. You'll get through it, it's fine. Basically, the arcade games have come a very long way. And yeah, they very much mirror the console ports and all the other stuff that's going on now. So yeah, this is a really cool book if you're interested in arcade history. You'll probably learn some stuff from it. I mean, there wasn't a whole lot historical, like history-wise, that I didn't know already, but the cultural part is very interesting, where she talks about how, basically how they've influenced popular culture, how there were lawsuits about them, how they were sort of an extension of the pinball industry and a lot of the mechanical games that moved on into the more video game sort of thing. I know I just totally rambled, but that's fine. Basically, if you're really into arcade games and you want to know a little bit more about their cultural significance, even if you don't even care about video games, you just want to know about like a cultural study or something along those lines, this would be a great book for that. So yeah, I really do recommend it. This is a wonderful book. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you guys have a book that you want me to read and review, as long as it has to do with the video game industry in some way, shape, or form, just leave it in the comments below and I'll definitely check it out. I know it's not December, but I wanted to get this, I finished this book a little bit quicker than normal, so I wanted to get my thoughts out. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and leave a comment below. If you have any suggestions for me to like either improve the series, or just have a book that you want me to read, just let me know. I know I'm kind of repeating myself here, but kind of rambling. And thank you very much. We are getting very close to my 1-year anniversary on YouTube, so by the time this comes out, it will be past my 1-year anniversary. So thank you very much for everybody that's been supporting me and has watched these videos. Just thank you to everyone out there. I really just do this as a passion project, and I'm I'm just trying to have as much fun as I possibly can with these, and I hope I've entertained you guys and maybe shed some light on a few video game books that you maybe never really knew about. Anyway, I will talk to you all later, now that I've given you like 3 send-offs and everything like that. So I hope you guys all have a great day, and I will see you all in the next video.